Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Essential Works by Individual Composers. And today's individual composer is Bruckner. In case you're wondering where that came from, just go have a look at Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein if you haven't seen it yet, and you'll get it immediately. Bruckner is one of those composers. I mean, the horses are in their stables now. Bruckner is one of those composers who is, well, he attracts an eccentric crowd. Let's just say it that way. And so getting into Bruckner, there are really two ways to do it. Either you're doing it as a prospective cult member, or you're doing it as a normal person. This is the normal person's approach to getting into Bruckner. Now, I have said many times that this series is not limited to a certain number of works per composer, like top 10 or whatever, because it depends on the composer, right? And with Bruckner, we are dealing with essentially 9 numbered symphonies, and there are a couple others. And then a few choral works. He actually wrote a considerable amount of music before the symphonies started coming out. He was in his 40s when he wrote his first symphony. So, there's tons of music, but we're talking about the music that matters and the music that's actually helpful to get into, to understand what makes him a great composer. And I have chosen count them, 2 works, because it's really all you need. It's fascinating because Bruckner only got into symphonic writing very late in his career. His idiom was rather fully formed, and while it did evolve, it evolved within the circumscribed universe of his musical expression. And so the evolution is not one that had much to do with outside influences and things, except maybe for some, tips from Wagner's handling of brass. Other than that, Bruckner is just Bruckner. He's just a sui generis thing. And you only need to hear one of his symphonies in order to know if you're going to like them, and if you want to experiment with the rest of them. Because his approach to symphonic writing was consistent all the way through. His handling of melody, his handling of harmony. It's very, very consistent. Now, that leads some people to say, well, he wrote the same symphony 9 times or 10 times or whatever. He didn't. He didn't at all. But as I said, his evolution occurs within certain parameters. What are those parameters? Those parameters are his use of block-like construction. In other words, his movements never move quickly. Even when they're marked to move quickly, they don't go quickly because he writes in sound blocks. Those blocks are often separated by pauses. They may contain single tunes, several tunes, multiple sections, but there's always this sense of huge architectural masses that you're sort of walking around like an architectural exhibit or a sculpture garden. And then seeing these things from different angles, and then you take a pause, or you go for a snack, and you come back, and there's another one. You go see number 2, then you go see number 3, then number 1 comes back. Then you're walking back and forth, and you're seeing they're musical objects almost. So although the music has its own natural rhythm and tempo and fluidity, it's not going to move the way other music usually moves. You have to be ready for an enlarged time scale and a general leisurely pace. That's the first thing. The second thing is he writes gorgeous slow movements, gorgeous adagios. They're almost all very slow. They're almost all practically imbued with this feeling of sacred music, of spirituality. I mean, his music is full of that kind of thing. He also writes gorgeous chorales for the brass, beautiful passages that sound like hymns in close harmony, and you find them everywhere in his music. But his slow movements particularly are songful and incredibly deep, designedly that way, profoundly profoundly expressive and beautiful. But again, they're long and big and slow. So you have to get used to that. His scherzos, that is the dance-like movements, seldom move very quickly. They all have the same form. You have an A section, it comes to a complete stop. You have a middle section, the trio section comes to a complete stop, and then an exact repeat of the A section. That's the form. But within that form, the variety is extraordinary. They're very, very different from each other in terms of how they sound. Finales with Bruckner are often a problem because he tends to say everything he needs to in the first movement in terms of the symphony as a whole. And the finale, which isn't going to move very quickly, is almost always cyclical in construction. That is, ideas from the beginning of the symphony, ideas or motives will come back at the very, very end, normally, sometimes before, but usually at the very end, and, in a blaze of glory. But the blaze of glory at the end is often not as convincing as the blaze of glory at the end of the first movement. And that's something you just have to get used to. Bruckner's finales are an issue. He had trouble with them. He had trouble finding ways to wind things up, and we just have to accept that and move on. Some of them are marvelous. No, don't get me wrong. It's not that the music isn't terrific. It's just that there's sometimes a motion problem in his finales, and that's, again, just the way it goes. And so, for the single symphony that you need as a beginner to experience, I chose the Seventh. It was Bruckner's first huge success as a composer, and deservedly so. It is a very top-heavy symphony. It has two big, long, slowish movements, followed by a zippy scherzo, and a comparatively zippy finale for Bruckner. It's not too long, and so the ending, when it comes, which is a sort of abbreviated Galupfi version of the ending of the first movement, isn't terribly disappointing. It works pretty well. But the crux of Bruckner, the heartbeat of Bruckner's symphonies, is always the slow movement. It's always the adagio. And this one, the adagio of this Seventh Symphony, is simply one of the greatest slow movements in the history of human thought. It is incredibly gorgeous, music of great solemnity and lyrical beauty that rises to a climax of absolutely insane grandeur. It's special, and if it doesn't hook you, nothing will. And I really believe this. You have to get hooked on Bruckner's slow movements if you're going to get hooked on Bruckner, because then you can put up with everything else. It's not that there's a need to put up with everything else. It's not that there isn't great music elsewhere. But if you get the heartbeat, the pulse of the music in those slow movements, then everything else makes sense, because these works are structured around these beautiful, solemn meditations. And so that's where you need to start. And if you like the Seventh, which begins with one of Bruckner's most beautiful themes on the cellos, it's gorgeous. If you like the Seventh, you're going to like the rest of them. You will find your way through them. I have no doubt about it whatsoever, and I don't feel there's any need to worry about it. And although I say the Seventh is top-heavy because the first two movements are so large and so moderate in tempo, the last two sort of form a unit. So you can think of the work as kind of a three-part entity. It has two big long movements at the beginning, and then two shortish ones, which if you jam together, you get a nice tail end of quick, lively music to send you home happy. I mean, it works really well. I mean, it really does. The Eighth has the opposite form. It has two quickish initial movements followed by two big, huge, slowish movements. So it's not the same symphony a million times. It's not. There's a lot of variety in the way Bruckner allocates his materials, but the nature of those materials is what's so personal to Bruckner. Now, I do have to say, for some reason, people seem to think that the best symphony to get to know first is the Fourth, because it has a title, The Romantic. It also has the most fabulous scherzo Bruckner ever wrote, with hunting horns ringing out all over the place. Gorgeous horn writing. It's very beautiful, but in some ways it's a problematic piece, in my view. The second movement, which is actually not an adagio, it's an andante, can sound really long and bogged down a bit. The finale is extremely long and involved and kind of goes nowhere. But beyond that, the fourth exists, as many Bruckner symphonies do, in a zillion different versions. And the fourth might have been a wonderful version to start with when there was only one version we were paying attention to, which was for most of our lives on disc. But the Bruckner people, who are completely insane, and I have to say this with pure objectivity, and who are treating every single thing he wrote with a Talmudic sense of hair-splitting rectitude. In other words, every note is as important as every other note. And because he was very insecure and wrote multiple versions, revised things multiple times, they are issuing complete scores of multiple symphonies of the same symphony. So the fourth now exists in at least 3 or 4 different versions, and you never know which one you're going to get. And it's ridiculous to ask people to have to deal with this. Or to put them all on the same level, because it's pretty clear what Bruckner wanted. It really is. I mean, when he died, he left sort of a list of what he considered the final versions or the preferred versions of all of his symphonies, and we know what they are, but the Bruckner people are doing their best. The Bruckner, musical scholarship and whatnot, there's a whole pyramid of scholarly garbage now all about this stuff. Are doing their best to try and make this as confusing and difficult as possible for you, the listener. The seventh has no such problem. There is only one issue, and that's whether there is a cymbal crash with some timpani underneath and a triangle roll at the climax of the adagio. I think it sounds better that way. There's controversy over whether Bruckner really wanted it, whether he invalidated it. Some people use it, some people don't, but it doesn't make much difference. And that's the point. It's not important. The rest of the symphony is intact. It's fine. And the symphonies you should start with are the ones about which there are no textural issues. So that means number 7, number 6, number 5, you're in good shape. And number 9, which is incomplete, but has 3 movements about which there isn't much question about what Bruckner wrote, because he died before he could write 50 versions of it. So there you go. That's where you need to start. Otherwise, you're going to wind up in a cesspool of craziness with different versions all over the place and nonsense like that. And it's not, unless you are totally, completely, blindly in love with this music, it's probably not something you're going to want to bother with. And I mean that very, very seriously, because the Bruckner people have done their very best to make him as inaccessible to people who are not Bruckner cult members. But the sad thing is that Bruckner is a great composer who's a genius in his own way. His music is fabulous, and it deserves to be heard. So there is one other work. Now, that's just the 7th Symphony we were talking about, that you should also hear by Bruckner, and that's a sacred work, his Te Deum. Bruckner was a master at sacred music. He wrote 3 exquisite masses. He wrote a bunch of other unaccompanied motets or accompanied motets for choir, all on Latin texts. And his Te Deum is quite simply one of the most thrilling choral works of the entire 19th century. And it's only 25 minutes long. Bruckner's vocal music is actually very concise because he had a very literal sense of text setting. He doesn't create things based on word repetition that just spin on endlessly. He basically does it syllabically, and occasionally he'll repeat something, but basically it's very straightforward. So the Te Deum is only 25 minutes long, and the interesting thing about it is that the very end of the Te Deum, with the words non confundar in aeternum, let me not be confounded forever, for all eternity. It's in you I have trusted, Lord. Let me not be confounded for all eternity. That's the thought being expressed. The music that he uses reappears in the slow movement of the 7th Symphony. It's a very dark, gloomy, sort of threatening, almost opening theme, followed by this prayer, non confundar in aeternum, which you hear in a version solely for the strings. So this is one of the rare cases where we know exactly what Bruckner had in mind when he wrote that music, when he used that music. And it tells us what the sort of spiritual essence of his thought is, because all of his music is, in a sense, religious music. Composing was for him a religious act. And, he dedicated his 9th Symphony to God. He was not He was an extremely devout person. And so to know that is helpful, first of all, and it will also introduce you to an absolutely rip-roaring, astonishingly primal, just incredibly powerful piece of choral writing. I mean, that Te Deum is astonishing. If you think Bruckner is slow and he can't be exciting, listen to the Te Deum. I mean, it'll rock your world. So those are the two pieces I think you need to get yourself started. And if you assimilate the style and enjoy it accordingly, knock yourself out. Go listen to the rest. Go listen to multiple versions of the various symphonies if you want to. Watch my videos about the Bruckner symphonies because it tells you which versions you should be hearing. And I did a video about the preferred versions of the Bruckner symphonies. So I will help you. I will guide you. And go to classicstoday.com and look at the reviews to find the best performances as well, in addition to my videos on each symphony, because we've covered them all. So there's lots of information out there to help guide you. But you got to be a little careful when it comes to Bruckner. And that's why I suggest that you start slowly, as Bruckner himself did, and then let your own musical inclinations guide you from there. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.